The sun hung like a malevolent eye above the dust-choked main street, its unforgiving gaze mirroring the town's own. Every glint from the storefront windows, every shadow cast by the weathered eaves, seemed to conspire in the silent, perpetual judgment that had become Martha's life. She moved through the sparse gathering of townsfolk not like a ghost, but like a living, breathing accusation, a constant reminder of something they wished to forget, or perhaps wished had never happened. Her dress, though clean, carried the faded hue of prolonged sorrow, a silent testament to the years she had endured their whispers, their averted eyes, and the biting remarks flung like stones in the desolate quiet. The air itself felt heavy with unspoken slurs, clinging to her like the fine grit that perpetually coated everything in Redemption Gulch. Each step she took was a conscious effort, a refusal to break. Though her spirit felt as brittle as sun-baked clay, her shoulders, perpetually hunched, carried the weight of a humiliation so profound it had become her very identity, etched into the lines around her eyes and the perpetual clench of her jaw. They saw not a woman, but a scandal, a blight upon their otherwise respectable lives, and their disdain, thick and suffocating, had built walls around her, trapping her within the confines of their collective contempt. She knew, with the chilling certainty of repeated experience, that no matter where she went, no matter how quiet she kept, the mockery would find her, a cruel echo bouncing off the unforgiving canyon walls. She was an open wound in their rigid, self-righteous society, and they picked at it with a chilling indifference. The burden was hers alone, a solitary penance in a world that offered no forgiveness, only relentless scrutiny. Yet, even in this suffocating isolation, a fleeting glance, sharper than the desert wind, cut through the haze of her despair. It was the quiet assessment of a man who stood motionless by the saloon's swinging doors, his shadow long and unyielding against the sun-scorched earth. He was new, perhaps, or merely an anomaly, for his presence seemed to carry a different kind of quiet, one that suggested observation rather than condemnation. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The very dust seemed to mock Martha. It swirled around her worn boots, kicking up miniature cyclones that mimicked the turmoil churning within her. The mercantile, usually a hub of muted gossip and transaction, became a gauntlet. Mrs. Abernathy, her face a roadmap of hardened judgment, meticulously wiped down a jar of pickles, her gaze lingering on Martha's empty basket, a silent commentary on her meager means and perceived worthlessness. The preacher, standing near the flour sacks, cleared his throat with deliberate emphasis as Martha passed, his eyes casting a shadow of moral condemnation that felt heavier than any sermon. She heard snippets of their conversations, words like fallen, unworthy, tainted, weaving through the air, each syllable a barb that found its mark. It wasn't just the words, but the way they were said, the knowing glances exchanged, the sudden silences that fell as she drew near, only to erupt again in hushed, vicious murmurs once she'd passed. Their cruelty was a practiced art, honed over years, a subtle, pervasive torture. She remembered a time when smiles had been offered, when pleasantries had been exchanged without the weight of their current, chilling subtext. That time felt like a dream from another life, a forgotten memory swallowed by the unforgiving reality of her present. Now, every interaction was a negotiation with their prejudice, a silent plea for a shred of decency that was never granted. The humiliation wasn't just a public spectacle. It had seeped into her bones, coloring her perception of herself. She saw the shame in their eyes, and in turn, saw it reflected in her own. Her reflection in the grimy window of the general store showed a woman aged beyond her years, her youth stolen by sorrow, her eyes haunted by unspoken grievances. Her hands, calloused from years of toil, trembled faintly. This was the crushing weight of a small town's collective scorn, a burden she had carried since the whispers began, since the truth was twisted into a grotesque lie. The quiet gunslinger, still motionless by the saloon, did not avert his gaze. It was a stare devoid of judgment, an oddity in this place where everyone seemed to have an opinion, a verdict. He watched her, not with pity, but with a detached intensity, like a hawk observing its prey, or perhaps an unreadable scholar studying a complex equation. There was a stillness about him that contradicted the restless energy of the street, a quiet power that seemed to absorb the dust and the heat without succumbing to them. He simply was, a stark, unyielding presence against the backdrop of Martha's unending torment. His eyes, though shadowed by the brim of his hat, seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom, a silent language that hinted at experience far beyond the confines of Redemption Gulch. The dry, rasping cough that escaped Martha was less a physical ailment and more a manifestation of the dust and despair that had settled in her lungs. She stopped for a moment, leaning against the rough-hewn timber of a deserted storefront, her breath catching in her throat. Just as she thought she could endure no more, a shrill laugh cut through the quiet hum of the afternoon, followed by a chorus of derisive snickers. From the saloon's swinging doors, 3 figures emerged, silhouetted against the dim interior. Jebediah Cobb, the town's most vocal and venomous self-appointed moral compass, led the charge. His jowly face was contorted into a sneer, his eyes alight with cruel amusement. Beside him stood his 2 hulking sons, mirror images of their father's brutishness, their grins wide and unsettling. "Well, well, if it ain't the soiled dove herself," Jebediah drawled, his voice carrying an exaggerated theatricality that made the few onlookers chuckle nervously. "Still gracing us with your presence, Martha. Thought you'd have taken the hint by now, slunk off to some other god-forsaken patch of dirt." His words, laced with venom, were meant to inflict maximum pain, to strip away any last shred of dignity she possessed. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. She clutched her empty basket tighter, knuckles white. She had learned long ago that defiance only fueled their fire, but surrender felt like swallowing ash. Her eyes, clouded with a profound weariness, flickered towards the quiet gunslinger. He hadn't moved, not a muscle, his form still a stark, unyielding silhouette against the saloon's entrance. He was a statue carved from shadow and stoicism, yet something in his unwavering stillness seemed to draw her gaze, a silent anchor in her churning despair. Jebediah advanced, his sons fanning out behind him, cutting off any escape. "Still think you can walk among decent folk?" he sneered, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper meant to carry. "After what you did? After you sullied this town's name with your indiscretions?" The word hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. He gestured dismissively towards her, as if swatting a fly. "We all know the truth, Martha. We all saw it. You're a blight, a shame on this honest town. Best you remember your place." His youngest son, a lanky youth with a cruel glint in his eyes, took a step forward, raising a hand as if to shove her. The mockery was escalating, threatening to turn physical, to become an open, public spectacle of her helplessness. Martha braced herself, her eyes closing, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. The humiliation was absolute, drowning her in its bitter current. Then, a voice, low and gravelly, cut through the stifling air, clear and resonant despite its quiet delivery. "That's enough." The words, though simple, fell like hammer blows, silencing the cruel jeers and the nervous chuckles that had begun to rise. Jebediah Cobb's hand, poised to shove Martha, froze midair. All eyes, including Martha's, snapped to the source of the interruption. The quiet gunslinger had moved. He hadn't rushed, hadn't drawn, hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply detached himself from the saloon's doorway, stepping into the dusty light, his movements fluid and economical, like a predator stalking its prey. His face, previously shrouded by shadow, was now visible, etched with lines that spoke of countless sunrises and far too many endings. His eyes, a piercing gray, held an unnerving stillness, a depth that swallowed sound and fury. He was not overtly menacing, but his presence was a palpable force, an undeniable shift in the oppressive atmosphere. He stood perhaps 20 feet from Jebediah, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, just inches from the polished grips of the 2 formidable revolvers holstered on his hips. The silence that followed his single, blunt statement was heavy, broken only by the mournful creak of the saloon sign swinging overhead. Jebediah, a man accustomed to dominating through bluster and intimidation, found himself unnerved. His swagger faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Who in the blazes are you, stranger?" he managed, his voice lacking its usual authoritative roar. The gunslinger offered no immediate reply, his gaze fixed on Jebediah, unwavering, unwavering. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible tension, a taut rope threatening to snap. The air thrummed with unspoken threats, with the sudden, chilling realization that this man was not part of the familiar, comfortable hierarchy of Redemption Gulch. Martha, still leaning against the rough wood, watched him through a haze of disbelief and burgeoning hope. She had never seen anyone stand up to Jebediah Cobb, not openly, not like this. The man's aura was not one of reckless bravado, but of quiet, absolute control, a dangerous calm that spoke of capabilities far beyond the average townsman. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, not pity, not anger, but a profound, almost weary understanding. It was a gaze that acknowledged her pain without defining her by it. Finally, the gunslinger spoke again, his voice still low, but carrying the weight of unyielding resolve. "I am the one who says that's enough." The words, though simple, carried an implicit threat, an unassailable boundary. Jebediah's sons, sensing the shift in their father's demeanor, shifted uneasily. The street, once a stage for Martha's humiliation, had become a precarious standoff, and the silent gunslinger, without raising a fist or drawing a weapon, had fundamentally altered the narrative. A silent, unsaid reputation, a history unknown to Redemption Gulch, hung in the dusty air around him. Jebediah Cobb, thoroughly outmaneuvered by the gunslinger's quiet authority, sputtered for a moment, then backed down, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He shot a final, venomous glare at Martha, a silent promise of future retaliation, before turning and hustling his sons back into the saloon, the swinging doors closing behind them with a muffled thud. The sudden quiet felt immense, stretching the boundaries of the ordinary. The few lingering townsfolk, who had previously been enthralled by the spectacle, now averted their eyes, shuffling away, anxious to escape the unsettling tension that still hung in the air. Martha remained where she was, her heart still thrumming against her ribs, but the suffocating weight had lifted, replaced by a bewildering lightness. The quiet gunslinger, whom she now saw clearly as Silas, did not immediately approach her. He merely stood, observing the emptying street, his presence a lingering shadow of defiance. When he finally turned to her, his expression was unreadable, his gray eyes deep pools of a history she couldn't even begin to imagine. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice still low, rough-edged, but laced with an unexpected gentleness. It was the first time in years anyone in Redemption Gulch had addressed her with such simple, unburdened courtesy. Martha found her voice, a fragile thread. Yes, thank you." Her gaze searched his face, trying to decipher his motives, his story. There was no pity there, she realized, no grandstanding, only a quiet, resolute concern. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing years of questions, of why no one had ever stepped in before. Silas's gaze shifted, looking past her into the middle distance. "Some things," he said, his voice softer now, almost a murmur, "just ain't right." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer a grand explanation. His reasoning was as blunt and unyielding as his intervention. He wasn't a savior. He was merely a man who saw an injustice and chose to act. His humility, stark against the backdrop of his formidable aura, was disarming. Then a sharp, unbidden image flashed through Martha's mind. Unbidden and unwelcome. The memory was brief, a haunting glimpse, the flickering lamplight in the saloon, the sharp crack of a gunshot, the spilled drink, and the look of betrayal in a man's dying eyes. It was a memory she had desperately tried to bury, the moment her life had irrevocably fractured, leading to the town's unforgiving verdict. She flinched, pulling herself back to the present. The cold touch of the wood against her back was a grounding sensation. Silas, ever observant, noticed her sudden pallor. He didn't ask, didn't pry. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her hidden pain, a recognition that went beyond words. Their connection, forged in the crucible of public humiliation and quiet defiance, was built on an unspoken understanding, a shared resonance of unspoken burdens. He was not a hero, she felt, not in the way stories were told, but something far more real, more raw. The uneasy peace that settled over Redemption Gulch after Silas's intervention was fragile. A thin veneer stretched over a simmering resentment. The town's collective pride, wounded by a stranger's defiance, began to fester. Jebediah Cobb and his cronies, fueled by alcohol and wounded ego, were not men to let such a public slight pass unpunished. Their whispers, once directed at Martha, now turned toward Silas, painting him as an arrogant outsider, a troublemaker disrupting their established order. The town's social fabric, woven tightly with prejudice and fear, tightened around him. Silas remained largely oblivious, or perhaps simply indifferent to the brewing storm. He moved through the town with the same quiet efficiency, his presence a stark contrast to the agitated hum that now permeated the air. He spent his days at the livery, mending tack, or by the creek, cleaning his revolvers with a meticulous, almost ritualistic care. Martha, however, felt the shift acutely. She sensed the hardening glares directed at Silas, the way conversation ceased abruptly when he approached. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that his act of kindness had placed him in danger, making him a target for the very forces that had sought to crush her. A new kind of anxiety gnawed at her, one that intertwined with a burgeoning sense of responsibility. She felt an inexplicable pull towards him, a desire to warn him, to shield him from the storm he had unknowingly conjured. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violent beauty, she found him sitting alone outside the livery, polishing a worn saddle. The fading light softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. His hands, though skilled, bore the faint tremors of a deeper strain, a weariness that went beyond physical exertion. "They're talking about you," Martha said, her voice barely a whisper against the vast silence of the plains. Silas continued his work, his gaze fixed on the leather. "They always do," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's the way of towns like this. They need a target." The starkness of his observation was unsettling. "But you stood up for me. That makes you a target." He paused, his movement slowing. He looked up, his gray eyes catching the last vestiges of daylight, reflecting a profound sadness. "I've been a target before, Martha. It's a familiar feeling." His voice was heavy, burdened by an unspoken past. He didn't elaborate, but the words hung in the air, revealing a profound and painful history, a history of conflict, perhaps of loss, that had shaped him into the stoic, morally ambiguous figure he was now. He was not a clean slate, but a man scarred by a life lived on the fringes, carrying the weight of choices made in desperate circumstances. The unspoken truth of his past, the flawed nature hinted at in his weary eyes, deepened the mystery of his character. He was a quiet force, yes, but a force forged in fires she could only begin to imagine, carrying the heavy burden of his own existence. The tension in Redemption Gulch became a palpable thing, thick as the dust on a windless day. Jebediah Cobb's bluster had solidified into a cold, dangerous resolve, infecting a growing number of townsfolk. They saw Silas not just as an outsider, but as an affront to their established order, a challenger to their rigid moral code. Threats, initially veiled, grew bolder, whispered at the saloon, muttered on the street. Silas, ever watchful, remained outwardly impassive. He knew the signs. He had seen this pattern unfold in countless dusty settlements before. The quiet man standing against the mob, the inevitable clash. He had faced it head-on, or walked away. This time, walking away felt different. Weighed down by the silent presence of Martha, a responsibility he hadn't sought but now carried. Martha, acutely attuned to the shifting currents of fear and malice, grew increasingly anxious. She felt the weight of the town's animosity pressing down on them both, a suffocating blanket. Her every glance at Silas was laced with worry, a silent question about the approaching storm. She saw the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his hand occasionally brushed against the grip of his revolver, a subconscious preparation for the inevitable. The night before the confrontation, the air was unusually still, charged with an almost electric anticipation. Martha couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, staring out at the star-dusted darkness, listening to the mournful howl of a distant coyote, a sound that mirrored the ache in her own soul. Her mind replayed the day's events, the pointed glares, the aggressive posturing of Jebediah's sons, the feeling of eyes watching them from every shadow. She felt a profound sense of powerlessness, the familiar fear of being trapped, just as she had been trapped in the aftermath of her own tragedy. Yet, interwoven with this fear was a fierce, unfamiliar spark of defiance. Silas had given her that, a quiet seed of courage planted in the barren soil of her despair. He had stood for her when no one else would. Could she in turn stand for him? Could she find the strength to face the darkness that was now gathering for them both? This internal struggle was a slow burn, a quiet fire igniting within her. She was no fighter, no woman of violence, but something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just the town's victim, the mocked and humiliated woman. She was a woman for whom someone had taken a stand, and that simple act had transformed her. She understood, with a chilling clarity, that the showdown was not just about Silas protecting her from the town's cruelty. It was about the town reasserting its dominance, about extinguishing the defiant spark that Silas had brought with him. It was about crushing any hope of a different kind of justice, a different way of being. The silence of the night was pregnant with the unspoken threat, a suffocating anticipation of the violence to come. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside, seemed to amplify the impending doom. The morning dawned, blood orange and ominous, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch like malevolent spirits. The main street, usually stirring with the early sounds of life, was eerily quiet, save for the distant crow of a rooster and the nervous snort of a horse from the livery. It was the quiet before the storm, the calculated stillness preceding inevitable violence. Martha stood by the window of her small cabin, watching Silas emerge from the livery stable, his silhouette stark against the harsh light. He checked his holsters, a deliberate, practiced motion that spoke of countless similar mornings. There was no hesitation in his movements, no outward sign of fear, only a grim acceptance of what lay ahead. Then, the figures began to emerge from the saloon's shadows, a dozen strong, led by Jebediah Cobb, his face a mask of triumphant malice. His sons flanked him, armed with rifles and pistols, their eyes alight with cruel anticipation. Other townsmen, those who had chosen to align themselves with Cobb's brand of righteousness, followed, their faces a mixture of bravado and nervous excitement. They fanned out, slowly, deliberately, cutting off Silas's escape route, corralling him in the center of the street. "Well, well, stranger," Jebediah's voice boomed, echoing in the unnatural quiet. "Looks like your time in Redemption Gulch is up. We don't take kindly to meddlers, especially ones who defend loose women." His gaze flicked towards Martha's cabin, a venomous taunt. Martha's breath hitched. Her blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, to warn him, but her voice was trapped in her throat, choked by fear. Silas remained motionless, his eyes scanning the approaching figures, assessing their numbers, their intent. His hands remained at his sides, but the air around him seemed to crackle with an unspoken energy. He was not a man of grand speeches. His language was that of action. "This ain't about her, Cobb," Silas said, his voice low, cutting through the rising tension like a sharpened blade. "This is about you, and your kind of justice." The words were blunt, challenging, tearing through the flimsy veil of Cobb's self-righteousness. Jebediah's face contorted in a sneer. "Don't you dare question our ways, stranger. We uphold the law, God's law, in this town." Then, the youngest Cobb son, emboldened by the numbers, raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Silas's chest. "You ain't got a chance, Gunslinger. Drop your weapons and walk away." The silence that followed was deafening, stretched taut, like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Silas's gaze locked onto the rifle, then swept across the faces of the men, each reflecting a twisted image of the town's prejudice. He saw the hatred, the fear, the ingrained cruelty. He was a deeply flawed man, yes, haunted by his own past. But in this moment, he embodied a raw, unflinching justice that Redemption Gulch had long forgotten. He was not fighting for honor or for glory. He was fighting for the simple, undeniable right to exist without judgment, to stand against the tide of collective scorn. The air thrummed with the impending eruption, the clash between a quiet, unyielding will and the brute force of a fearful mob. The rifle shot, when it came, was not from Jebediah's son, but from Silas himself, a lightning-fast draw that defied the human eye. The young cob's son cried out, clutching his shoulder, the rifle clattering to the dust. The impact of the gunshot echoed, a brutal punctuation mark in the tense standoff. This was not a warning shot, it was a statement. Silas's movements were economical, ruthless. He didn't draw both weapons, only the one from his right hip, his left hand remaining free. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, was now etched with a grim determination, the lines around his mouth pulled tight. His eyes, cold as slate, moved from one man to another, a silent challenge. "I said, this ain't about her," Silas repeated, his voice low, almost a growl. "This is about your fear, your cruelty." His words, stripped bare of pretense, were a brutal truth. The gun in his hand was an extension of his will, a stark symbol of his morally ambiguous nature. He wasn't a hero in a white hat. He was a force of reckoning, driven by an inner code that defied easy categorization. The confrontation exploded into chaos. Jebediah's men, startled by Silas's sudden aggression, opened fire, bullets kicking up dust around Silas's feet. But he moved with a terrifying grace, a dance with death he had perfected over years of hard-won survival. He fired again, a precision shot that disarmed another man, then moved, dodging a clumsy swing from one of Cobb's sons. Martha, watching from her window, screamed, a sound torn from the deepest part of her soul. She saw Silas, outnumbered, outgunned, yet fighting with a ferocity born of desperation and an unyielding will. She saw the blood bloom on his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He was hurt, truly hurt, and in that moment, something within her snapped. The years of humiliation, the silent suffering, the crushing weight of their judgment, it all coalesced into a blinding surge of defiance. She would not stand by and watch him fall, not after he had stood for her. She burst out of her cabin, a small, trembling figure against the backdrop of the violence, her hands empty but her spirit ablaze, her eyes, wide with a newfound resolve, locked onto Silas. He turned, momentarily distracted by her sudden appearance, his gaze sharp, surprised. "Martha, get back!" he roared, his voice strained with pain. But she didn't heed him. Instead, she ran, not towards the men, but towards Silas, her intention clear, to be with him, to stand by him, no matter the cost. As a hulking figure raised a rifle butt to strike Silas from behind, Martha launched herself forward, a desperate, reckless act. She didn't manage to stop the blow entirely, but her unexpected presence deflected it, causing the blow to glance off Silas's side instead of his head. He grunted, stumbling, but as he regained his footing, his eyes met hers, and in that fleeting, chaotic moment, a raw, undeniable connection solidified between them. He reached out, not to push her away, but to steady her, his calloused hand closing over hers, a silent, powerful promise forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. It was the pivotal emotional climax, the moment the quiet gunslinger, wounded and defiant, took her hand, accepting her as an equal in this brutal, terrifying dance. The gunfight ended not with a final, dramatic shot, but with a sudden, eerie silence. Silas, his shoulder bleeding profusely, stood over the prone form of Jebediah Cobb, whose face was a mask of shock and pain. The other townsmen, demoralized and disarmed, had scattered, melting back into the shadows of the street, leaving a trail of dropped weapons and nervous dust. The air, still thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, now carried the faint, metallic tang of blood. Martha was still gripping Silas's hand, her fingers interlocked with his, a silent anchor in the turbulent aftermath. The chaos had receded, leaving behind a profound stillness, a raw, exposed quiet. She looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing beyond the stoic facade to the pain etched in his eyes, the weariness that settled deep in his bones. He was a man of violence, yes, a gunslinger, whose past was surely steeped in blood and difficult choices, but he was also the man who had stood for her, who had taken her hand when the whole world had turned its back. The silence was broken only by Silas's ragged breathing. He slowly released her hand, not out of rejection, but to check his wound, his fingers pressing against the gushing blood, a grimace flickering across his face. "Foolish woman," he rasped. But there was no anger in his voice, only a profound weariness and a flicker of something akin to admiration. "You shouldn't have come out here." Martha met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I couldn't just stand by." Her voice was still trembling, but firm. The words were a quiet testament to her own transformation, to the breaking of her self-imposed silence. The cost of their defiance was evident. The street was littered with the detritus of conflict, a stark reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. The town itself, though momentarily cowed, would remember this day. It would carry the scars of the confrontation, just as Silas would carry his wounds. The victory was not clean, not without consequence. It was grounded in the harsh realities of their world. Silas leaned against a dusty post, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked around the deserted street, his gaze sweeping over the empty windows, the closed doors, the silence that now felt less like fear and more like cautious retreat. "They won't forget this," he murmured, his voice laced with an irony that spoke of long experience. "This isn't over, not truly." He knew the nature of men, of towns built on fear and prejudice. This was a temporary reprieve, a shift in the power dynamic, but the underlying rot remained. Martha, sensing the deep-seated weariness in him, stepped closer, her hand hovering near his injured shoulder. A silent offer of aid. She wasn't a healer, but she was present, a steadfast anchor in the aftermath of the storm. The mystery of his past, the layers of his flawed character, seemed to coalesce into a profound understanding. He had not sought this fight, but he had faced it, not for glory, but for a simple, universal principle of human dignity. The town, in its silent judgment, had been exposed, its cruelty laid bare. The truth, in all its brutal simplicity, now hung in the quiet, dusty air. The first rays of the new dawn painted the bruised sky with streaks of fragile hope, a stark contrast to the dark, lingering shadows of the night. The town of Redemption Gulch was still, unnaturally so, as if holding its breath. The street, where the battle had raged, had been swept clean of the overt signs of conflict, but the echoes of shattered complacency lingered, a silent testament to the events that had transpired. Silas, his shoulder bandaged crudely but effectively by Martha, sat on her small porch, watching the sun rise. He had refused her offer of a bed, preferring the cool, stark comfort of the open air. His pain was evident in the subtle clench of his jaw, but his eyes, though still weary, held a newfound stillness, a quiet resolve. Martha sat beside him, the silence between them no longer a burden, but a comfortable, shared space. They were two broken individuals, scarred by life's cruelties, yet now irrevocably bound by an act of raw, defiant courage. She had been the humiliated, he the quiet gunslinger, but in the crucible of conflict, they had found something akin to mutual respect, a shared understanding that transcended words. "What will you do now?" Martha finally asked, her voice soft, barely disturbing the stillness of the morning. Silas turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. There was no easy answer, no grand plan. He was a wanderer, a man of the fringes, his existence defined by the dust and the open road. Yet, something had shifted. The cold detachment that had once defined him was tempered by a warmth he hadn't known he possessed. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty stark in his gravelly voice. "But I'm not leaving yet." The words, simple and unadorned, carried the weight of a profound decision, a quiet promise. He wasn't just staying, he was choosing to remain, choosing to face the lingering resentment of the town for her. The choice was a powerful symbol of his own redemption, not from a sin of his past, but from a life lived in solitary isolation. The town, in its own way, had begun to change. The fear of Silas was palpable, yes, but so too was a grudging respect, a realization that their old ways, their ingrained cruelties, could no longer go unchallenged. The stereotypical societal figures who had once mocked Martha now avoided her gaze, their bravado shattered. The symbolism was clear. The quiet gunslinger, a metaphor for righteous action, had taken the hand of the mocked, symbolizing the reclaiming of dignity. Their bond was not one of romance, but of shared burdens, of finding strength in unexpected alliances. The harsh landscape of Redemption Gulch, with its unforgiving sun and desolate plains, no longer felt like a prison, but a place of new beginnings, however fragile. The future was not without its challenges, its lingering darkness, but for the first time in years, a faint, undeniable sliver of hope had pierced through the bleakness. Their story was far from over, but the turning point had been reached. The quiet gunslinger, with his flawed past and unyielding will, had taken her hand, not just in the dust of a violent street, but in the quiet, reflective landscape of her soul, offering a silent promise of a future forged in shared resilience. The wind, stirring through the dried grasses, whispered new possibilities, carrying with it the quiet echoes of a battle won and a journey, together, just begun.